Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and I'm pleased to have with me today the recipient of this year's Emerging Civil War Book Award, Robert Gudmestad. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to be here.
I'm delighted to have you with us, and so glad to be able to talk about a really cool book. And
Thanks. Yeah, can,
yes,
can I show a picture of it?
please do. The Devil's Own Purgatory, the United States Mississippi River Squadron in the Civil War. And this is an area that's getting a lot of attention recently, but you've got a really cool take on it with
Thanks.
a close look at the soldiers or the sailors' lives who were
hmm
involved with this. So let me just ask you, first of all, you're at Colorado State University. How does a landlocked professor in Colorado get interested in the Mississippi River Squadron?
It was an accident. My second book was about Mississippi River steamboats.
Okay.
And that book ended really about 1860, and I had just a few paragraphs at the end of the book saying that for the most part, river traffic stopped because of the Civil War. And the question you get when you write a book is always, what's the next book going to be about? And I thought a lot about it, and I did some research and thought, the Mississippi Squadron would be a really good book to write, kind of thinking about it, not as a sequel per se, but I knew a lot about riverboats and about the Mississippi River and wouldn't have to do as much kind of background research. But I didn't want to get pigeonholed as kind of that steamboat guy.
Yeah.
So I resisted doing any research in this topic. And I looked at a variety of other topics, but it just kept calling me back. And once I got immersed in it, like one of the best decisions I ever made with regards to research.
Oh, wow, fantastic. That's always a nice realization to come to, isn't it?
Yeah.
Uh, so how long did it take you to research the book since you did have some background in it?
Yeah. The research and writing process took a total of 12 years.
Okay.
Now, part of that is I've been department chair at Colorado State University for 8 years, and being department chair isn't necessarily conducive to research and writing in scholarship. So it certainly slowed me down. But when I started the book, I read the the monographs or the books that had already been out there, books like Gary Joyner's book on the Mississippi Squadron and gunboats down the river, some of the classic works. And I thought, yeah, this is going to take maybe 3 years to do. Um, but once I got into the research, I went in so many unexpected directions that it just kept going.
Mhm. Now, tell me a little bit about that because, certainly, you, as you'd mentioned, you've got some background in this topic, you've got a
Yeah.
rough idea, and yet there's new stuff to discover. What was that sense of discovery like for you as you found these new avenues to explore?
It was fun. It was also, I would say, rewarding, but maybe a little bit frustrating too. It's sort of like, okay, now I've got to deal with all of these things in a good way. And I've got colleagues in the Department of History who study. There's one colleague in particular who does research on Greece and Rome, and she says all of our sources already exist. In terms of there's nothing new to be found
Yeah.
in terms of the sources. And so you're thinking about new ways to interpret them, or maybe you're looking through an environmental frame instead of something else. And here I wouldn't say that there are new sources. I would, with the book, I would say that there are sources that have not been used in any significant way. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. First of all, the muster rolls. And most people who read the book, one of the first comments they make is about the data set of the sailors. Well, those muster rolls have been consulted before. Um, David Riggs wrote an article maybe 30 years ago in Civil War history where he looked at the muster rolls of the USS Cairo, or excuse me, the muster roll. There was only one that survives, because the boat was sunk by a torpedo in the Yazoo River in December of '62. And so he analyzes that. And I thought, okay, that's really interesting. And so, I went to the National Archives, and at first I sampled the muster rolls, and I can talk maybe a little bit more about that later on. Um, but they haven't been used to any significant extent by anyone else writing about the Mississippi River Squadron. And also the deck logs of the boats. They've been consulted a little bit, but I did much more reading into the deck logs than, at least for the Mississippi Squadron, than anyone else, at least in terms of, reading through footnotes or reading through other histories of the fleet.
Now, if someone
And,
don't, for those who don't know what
also, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, for those who don't know what a deck log is, maybe you
Oh
could
yeah,
explain that.
okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I talk like everybody's, a naval expert. So a deck log is a recording of more or less some of the daily activities on a boat. And you had two two men who were responsible for recording the deck log. So they're on and off in a 24-hour shift. And much of the entries for the deck log, or many of the entries in a deck log, are the weather and river conditions and those kinds of very practical things. But then there's also a lot of other entries that are, for instance, when the boats were running past Vicksburg, of course, a very famous episode for the Mississippi Squadron, there would be essentially long 2 or 3 paragraph descriptions of what that episode was like. Or what I found, surprisingly, I never expected this, was that there were frequent mentions of punishment in the deck logs. And so it would be Sailor John Jones was confined in double irons for disobedience, things like that. Or there might be notations about the number of men who were sick at any given time on the boat, or sometimes men who were transferred onto the boat, men who were transferred off the boat. There was a fair amount of consistency, but not an exact amount of consistency between the various boats. And then the other source is the official records of the navies, the ORN. So there's a 127 volume of the official records of the Army, but then there's also the Navy. And historians have consulted those as well. And there's a lot of information about the Mississippi Squadron and the other squadrons in the ORN, but no one had looked at it systematically in terms of quantifying some of the information in it. So those are the sources that I wouldn't say are new per se, but I think they're underutilized by other historians. And then of course I read essentially every letter, diary, sets of whatever primary sources from the sailors themselves, and of course from the officers also.
Now, just to help people understand how much data this is that you had to wade through. I mean, when you're talking muster rolls and deck logs, this isn't just like for like 2 or 3 ships. This is for a lot of ships.
Yeah,
Help us kind of put that into context.
right. There were 127 boats in the Mississippi Squadron. And on the face of it, this should be jaw-dropping to people because this fleet did not exist when South Carolina seceded in 1860. So the United States built this fleet from scratch. Now, sometimes the boats already existed as civilian boats, and then they're converted to a military vessel. And other the some of the ironclads especially are built from scratch, particularly by James Eads, from St. Louis and elsewhere. So just the number of boats themselves is immense. When you look at the fleet just by the number of boats, it is the second largest squadron in the U.S. Navy, second only to the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron.
Wow,
So it's a big fleet. So it's 127 boats by my count, and muster rolls exist for about I think 119 of those boats. However, um, the the Mississippi Squadron itself was originally I call it a bastard child of the Army and the Navy,
Okay.
uh, because the Army acquired the first boats and helped pay for the construction of the first boats, but the Navy staffed them with sailors. But then in October of 1863, the fleet is transferred fully under naval control, and its name gets changed to bring the name in line with the rest of the squadrons. So originally it was the Western Gunboat Flotilla. That was kind of the Army name, but it becomes the Mississippi Squadron because you had other squadrons in the Navy. Well, my point is, when the Navy gets full control of the fleet, then it institutes more regular naval practices. And among those naval practices was to keep muster rolls. And so the effective date of the muster rolls is from October of 1862, but really January 1st, 1863. So it might help your readers if I explain a muster roll, probably. And I don't want to get too deep into the muster rolls, but they are important. So they exist in the National Archives. They've also been scanned and made available online to the National Archives site. So originally, I didn't know that they were scanned, and so I was doing research with the original muster rolls, and I was literally scanning them with my phone and then printing them out when I got back to my office. But I found out by chance that they'd been scanned, and so that really jump-started the research. But they're large. They're maybe maybe about 3 feet across and almost maybe 18 inches high. So it's a big rectangular sheet of paper. And it has a lot of information, including the sailor's name, when he enlisted, where he enlisted, the term of enlistment, his rating, which is a rank in the Army. It has his height, his hair color, his eye color, his skin color, his occupation, where he was born, um, and other comments as well. So it's when you think about it from the perspective of a historian, this is a tremendous amount of demographic information. And so what I did was to begin going through these muster rolls, and then I hired students at CSU to help me go through these muster rolls and record the information and create a data set.
Mm.
And so it's a sampling, but we looked through literally hundreds and hundreds of muster rolls and came up with a data set of close to 14,000 sailors who served in the fleet.
Wow. Wow. Did you get to know any of these guys as you were working with them? I mean, because that's,
Yeah, yeah.
14,000 is a statistic, but these are all very personal details.
In some cases, yes. And the students would say the same thing, that you kind of start rooting for a guy, so to
Mm.
speak. So when you're going through the muster roll, so we did a sample. So we at most sampled 3 muster rolls from one boat, 9 months apart. So sometimes, if a boat was only in service for the last 6 months of the war, we only have one muster roll for it, for instance. But the ones who had been in service a long time, we looked at 3 muster rolls. And you're right. So you can kind of glean interesting stories. And you know, some of them are very sad. Uh, I recall one about some sailors who contracted disease, and they were sent to the pest house, like the pestilential house. It was essentially a like a mini leper colony.
Yeah.
This was really common. I've since come to find out in antebellum America, and uh, the boat that they were sent on capsized and they drowned. Like there were 2 sailors. So they get sick and then they get sent to the pest house and they drown on the way. Or you have men, especially thinking about formerly enslaved men or immigrants, both groups of which faced discrimination in the Navy. And so you're kind of wondering, okay, did they how did they cope with those conditions? And so sometimes you can see a rise in rating or rank for these men over time. But then also there are other times where it'll just be a notation will be drowned. And there's nothing associated with it. And so you're wondering, you want to know the full story there too. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. There are these like smaller stories within this grand tapestry that you really want to dig into.
So, and this is one of my problems. I get going. I'm so interested. I probably should have said, like, hey, could you give us a little synopsis of what your book is about? But I dive right in because I mean, this is just
Yeah.
fascinating stuff to me. It's neat to hear the way that you're grappling with all this information.
Yeah.
But for folks who are unfamiliar with the Devil's Own Purgatory, what's
Right.
the little thumbnail?
The Mississippi Squadron, I argue, was an essential partner in winning the war in the Western theater because it did a variety of things. And people who have studied the Civil War know some of those things. So they know that the fleet at Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Island number 10, running past the Vicksburg batteries, and some of these other kind of traditional fights against Confederate military installations. Arkansas Post or Fort Hindman is another example. Those are pretty well known. And a lot of people also know that the fleet was important for destroying the small Confederate fleet that was on the Western waters. The Confederacy only put, around 12 to 15 boats, serviceable boats into action against the Union fleet. So you're looking at 10 times as many Union boats as Confederate boats. And so there's the Battle of Memphis, June 6, 1862, and then the destruction of the CSS Arkansas. Those are very famous as well. A lot of people know about them. And so I tell those stories in the book. And so that certainly helps the army because as the army's advancing, it has to be able to control the rivers. And most of the major battles in the Western theater, the land battles early in the war take place along a river. So it's no coincidence. The rivers are avenues of invasion. And then the fleet also gets involved in sort of these it's almost like Apocalypse Now, and these side ventures, so to speak. And so there's one on the White River in Arkansas. You've got the Yazoo Pass and the Steele's Bayou around Vicksburg, and of course you have the Red River campaign in 1864. Um, Almost all of them lead to bad things for the Navy. And in a few cases, you almost lose a significant number of boats, and the Army has to bail them out because of low water and some other things. Those are pretty well known too. But there are a couple other things that historians really haven't studied, and so I highlight them a little bit more in the book. One is the the way that the fleet assisted the Army with its supplies and protected the supply network. So as the Union Army penetrated further into Confederate territory, its supply lines getting longer and longer, and it's using railroads and it's using steamboats and it's using some wagon trains as well. But I argue that steamboats, at least early in the war, took primacy over railroads. One Ohio River steamboat could carry the same amount of supplies as about 120 rail cars.
Uh-huh.
So it's a more efficient way of moving supplies. And the Confederates realized this, not surprisingly. So the Confederates begin attacking the Union supply line. So it's well known that they attacked railroads and were blowing up bridges and those kinds of things. There have been several good books on that. But the attack on the water supply line, the riverine supply line, hasn't been described really at all. And so the Confederates then create what I call ambush squads. There are these groups of um, artillery, like maybe four cannon or so, 4 to 6 cannon, and cavalry. And they're posted along the rivers, especially the Mississippi. And their job is to attack those Union supply boats as they go down the river or up the river. They're fairly effective. And so now the Mississippi Squadron is tasked with getting rid of those attackers. So now they're fighting this counterinsurgency war. So these are sailors, right? So there are all sorts of ironies nested within ironies. They never sail. These boats don't have masts and they don't use wind power. They only use coal and wood to power the boats. So even this, they're sailors, they're not sailing, in the traditional sense. And even, the sailors in the Blue Water Navy, those boats were today we'd call them hybrids for the most part, part sail and part coal. So these guys signed up because, they're going to serve on a boat, but now they're being told, okay, we're going to send a shore party out of 20 guys and we're going to go attack these guerrillas. That's a whole different thing because now you're venturing into enemy territory and you can be subject to an ambush. So for how far out do you go? And then they're also dealing with civilians, which they never expected to do. And very often the sailors are taking their frustrations out by burning plantations, by burning down gin houses, by confiscating food. And so you get this really interesting protection of the supply lines, anti-guerrilla war that's going on really from mid 1862 through the end of the war. And that becomes the activity that the fleet is engaged in the most.
Mm.
Because the regular war only happens episodically. It's one day against Fort Henry. It's one day against Arkansas Post, whereas it's every day against these guerrillas.
Mm.
And then a final thing, and I know is not a thumbnail. This is, I don't know, much bigger
Oh, this.
synopsis. Is the fleet, and I never expected this, didn't think about it, is the fleet was also involved in emancipation and freeing of enslaved people. And some of those enslaved people became sailors on the boat, something maybe we can talk about later on.
Yeah.
But the fleet also assisted in the transportation of women and children and old men. So basically, people who would not enlist in the Navy to contraband camps. So contraband camps were areas where the U.S. government sheltered formerly enslaved people during this very difficult transition from slavery to freedom.
And what I really find fascinating about this is that, I mean, you weave together a narrative arc for the squadron as a whole. And I think, at least in my experience, like most people have looked at the squadron in the context of like Grant is working with the Navy here, or,
Right.
is much more episodic, and it's usually as part of some campaign as opposed to the squadron itself having its own story to tell.
Yeah. I tried to write this book in a way that someone a, who had a casual interest in the Civil War and or history would actually want to read it.
Yeah.
And so I tried to make it more of a story and, as you say, have more of a narrative arc to it. Now, there are a couple of chapters that are more like a traditional monograph that are more analytical, but I wanted to, I mean, th this fleet is so interesting. I mean, where else do you have a captain who's captured because he's going to a church service? Or another captain who tries to sell his boat to the guerrillas,
Mm.
or another captain who's basically running a protection ring in Louisiana and shaking down local civilians. So there are these great stories to tell.
Yeah. Now, the squadron itself, and you talked a little bit about how, it's sort of this hybrid organization between the Army and the Navy,
Yeah.
until 1863. Why is it that nobody wanted ownership of what was happening on the waters in the West early in the war?
I think because it's kind of caught in between.
Hmm.
It's obvious with the Blue Water Navy, with say the North Atlantic Block. Well, it's the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron comes into existence. I mean, it's kind of pulled out of the rest of the Navy, but it's clear what that's going to do. It's going to attack Confederate boats on the high seas, and it's going to institute the blockade and help with, any attacks on, Confederate fort. So that the the duties of a blue water navy had evolved very clearly over time. But a river-based navy, you the only thing that comes close to it is the Battle of Lake Erie in the War of 1812, where the U.S. government created ships. So what I write about boats. So boats have more or less a flat bottom, and they're mostly on rivers. Ships mostly have more of a V or a U because they are meant to go into the water, and that provides ballast or balance because of storms and waves. Whereas, in the river, you want to more float on top rather than go deep because of the shallowness of the rivers. So the Navy built these ships for the Battle of Lake Erie, but that's the only in American military history, that's the only thing that's really close. There's a little bit in the American Revolution, but not much. Um, so this is new. And the one thing that really struck me in thinking about this project is how much the Union military was willing to experiment and try new things. And even without having a lot of guardrails in place for these new things, there's a lot of innovation and ingenuity in the Union war effort. And the Mississippi Squadron is part of that as well. And so that kind of gets to, okay, yes, these boats are on the water, but to what extent are they coordinating with the Army?
Mhm.
And, do you want to detail a bunch of soldiers to go on a boat, or do you want to have men who are more familiar with the workings of a sea vessel, even though it's not on the sea? So the Mississippi Squadron is a platypus.
Uh,
It's this mix of all these things, and nobody really knows what to do with it.
yeah. But as you say though, that because there's so much innovation, I mean that sort of leaves room for that innovation to happen. I think about Charles Ellet's Ram fleet, and like
Right.
that's the result of that kind of nobody wants ownership, and so someone kind of sneaks in with an idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he revives a practice that had been dead since, you know, uh, I guess, I don't know, the last effective ram was either Greece or Rome, so it's something that's been dead for thousands of years.
Yeah. So, as the Army and the Navy are kind of sorting through this, I understand Simon Cameron also sort of sees some opportunities in the early days of taking some ownership here.
Yeah, he does to a certain extent, but he's not that interested in the fleet. He's more interested in how many soldiers can I get, on the battlefield. And I think I mean, he really passes it off and it goes to Gideon Wells.
Yeah.
And Wells is not interested in the Blue Water Navy, or excuse me, the Brown Water Navy. He's more interested in the Blue Water Navy. So it's his assistant, Gustava Fox, who is more involved in the fleet than um, probably any other cabinet member. Eventually, Wells comes around and he realizes the value of the fleet, especially when Grant is having difficulty taking Vicksburg.
Hmm.
Because Grant's first attempt to take Vicksburg is a very, very traditional campaign. What does he do? He follows the railroad north out of Tennessee into Mississippi. But when the Confederates cut the railroad, then he's got to retreat. And so, he goes through essentially six different ways to try to capture the city. And of course, both the new Secretary of War, but also Wells are, they're putting a lot of pressure on Grant to get this done. And So Wells, really around Vicksburg, takes a lot more interest in the Mississippi Squadron.
And that always fascinated me, considering, the Anaconda Plan gets laid on the table early in the war. We
Yeah.
know we're going to have to do something about the Mississippi River, and Lincoln, of course, understands its importance, and yet nobody wants ownership of that, which just has
Yeah,
always amazed
yeah,
me.
and but originally they were thinking in terms of the Army was in terms of what were called floating batteries.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these would be boats that had no motive power. They'd be towed from place to place, but they would essentially have an array of cannons on them. And so they'd be kind of plug and play bombardment units. And it's really only, again, through more experimentation that you get first the timberclads.
Yeah.
That's the genesis of this fleet, and they're boats that are wrapped in wood, thick wood oak planks, essentially 8 to 10 inches thick, and they can withstand musket balls, but not cannonballs. And the fleet just slowly evolves, and so the Army and the Navy have to figure out, as this fleet is demonstrating its importance, what do we do with it?
Hmm. So, as all this experimentation is going on and innovation and evolution, all words you've used, do you have a favorite innovation or favorite moment that something happened and there's a big light bulb that really kind of seems really important?
Favorite innovation? That's a really good one. Um, I would say it's not it's not perhaps super interesting, but I think my favorite innovation is the tin clad.
Okay.
And um, the tin clad was meant to suppress guerrillas. That's and to protect the Union supply line because they were cheap and quick to build, and they didn't need nearly as many sailors as the large uh, ironclads like the USS Cairo and some of the other ironclads. These boats fascinate me in a lot of ways, and Myron Smith Jr. has a good book on the tin clads. But these were existing Ohio River steamboats that get purchased by the government and then converted. And when I say converted, they literally wrap what was called boilerplate. Again, that's a word that has, stayed in language, but boilerplate was 1 inch thick iron, sheet iron essentially. So they put a sheet of this around the main level of the boat, and that can protect mostly from mini balls, from musket balls. And then they will put a couple cannons on the deck, and then put a crew of 80 to 110 men on these boats and say, go fight the guerrillas.
Mm.
And so the Union cranks out about 70 of these boats, and so they're numerous, but they're just really interesting. And maybe the other really interesting thing, and this gets to, I think, ingenuity and experimentation, is this fleet has the Navy's first hospital boat or
Mm.
hospital ship. It's the USS Red Rover, um, and it's staffed by the Mississippi Squadron, and it's partly a response to the intense amount of disease that happens amongst the fleet in 1862. But it has operating rooms, it has recovery rooms, it has places to store ice so that you can cool the soldiers and the sailors who are recuperating there and make their time more comfortable. And this boat also has women on it. You have women who are employed by the United States Navy as nurses serving on this boat. And you also have at least two nuns on the boat as well. And they're there, of course, to be nurses to the sailors who are incapacitated.
Yeah. Where was the Red Rover based out of or
It was
stationed?
based out of Memphis.
Okay.
There was a Navy hospital. It was Hospital Pinckney, named after the primary surgeon of the fleet, whose first name was Ninian, Ninian. That's a great name if you're looking up baby names, Ninian Pinckney. But it was as the fleet's advancing further, you're getting further away from the hospital, if that makes sense. And so the Red Rover could be closer, but it seemed to spend most of its time near Memphis. And one thing that I write about in the book is that the first woman in American history to get a military pension for military service as a woman serves on the Red Rover.
Mm.
So there's some women who I don't want to get into, trans and,
Yeah, yeah. They
that kind
just
of thing.
they
Because
dressed as
back
men
then,
and
you're a man or you're a woman. In
yeah.
1860, 61, there was no concept of bisexual or transsexual. So there were women who served as men in the army and may have gotten a pension. But her name is Anne Stokes, and she originally applied for a pension because she was married to a sailor in the fleet who was killed late in the war. And she applied for a pension based on his service and it was denied. So then she applied for a pension based on her own service. And I've read the pension file. It's scanned and online through Fold 3 if people have a membership to Fold 3. And there's a typed letter in there essentially saying from an official in the pension bureau saying the way the law is written, it does not specify sex, male or female, and therefore she should be rewarded. She should be awarded a pension.
Oh wow, that's cool. So as you know, talking about these sorts of innovations, were there innovations in tactics that also came about during the war as the armies or as the Navy's trying to figure out how to fight on a river or a river system?
There are a few innovations, but really not that many. It's these boats have. Let's take the city class ironclads. They have 13 cannons on them, big cannons, 64 pounders usually, or 32 pounders. When I say pounder, that means that's the size, the weight of the shot that they're firing. They have four cannons on each side. So the idea is, you're going to do a broadside. What they really didn't take into account is you can't do a broadside on a river because the channels are too narrow.
Uh,
So these boats are fighting forward looking, if that makes sense, with their bows towards the Confederate fort rather than their side toward the Confederate fort. And so you can only have maybe two or three boats at a time in the river, and then you've got other boats behind them who are shooting over them. So the Navy has to make an account for the fact that this is not like the Blue Water Navy where, if you think, if people are familiar with Fort Fisher, you can line up 80 boats, and you can just pound it. You can't do that on the river. And so they figure out pretty quickly that these boats really are not going to destroy a fort, that they really have to be in concert with the Army. And Ulysses S. Grant, especially, and William Tecumseh Sherman had a great working relationship with the admirals who were in charge of the Mississippi Squadron. And so I think what you see is really an evolution of these combined operations between the Army and the Navy.
uh
And I would say that for me is the most significant, say, evolution of tactics or strategy. And so you have some instances of um, naval gunfire support where you have the Army on the land, and then you have the Navy firing the cannons, at the targets that the Army is attacking. And that takes a fair amount of coordination, especially given by our standards, the low level of technology during the Civil War in terms of the accuracy of the cannons. So I'd say that's the biggest innovation when you're thinking about strategy. And then the other one, is the anti-guerrilla or the anti-guerrilla operations as well. That just evolves
yeah.
over time.
You mentioned the narrowness of the channels, and to me, yeah, I've always been fascinated how the river itself is kind of an adversary for and it doesn't take sides, and
Right,
like when Farragut's bringing his ocean-going ships up the river the first time, and he's just getting pummeled by deadheads that are floating down, and
right.
it's like, tell me a little bit about the logistics of just being in a river versus in an open body of water.
Well, number one, as you say, you're very confined in what you can do, between bank to bank. But even in the river itself, there's a deeper part of the channel and a shallower part of the channel. And depending on the draft of the boat, you may have to stay in the deep part of the channel. So that means, say the river is, I don't know, 100 yards wide, maybe only effectively the boat can be in 60 yards of that. if that makes
Yeah.
because you're going to ground on a sandbar otherwise. And so what happens is as the river, of course, we know that the Mississippi River is very sinuous. And so as the river is going around a channel, it's going to carve a deeper part or going around a corner, if you will, a bend. It's going to carve a deeper part of the channel closer to the shore so that the part of the channel that you want to be in isn't necessarily always in the middle of the river. Now it tends to be in a straight portion, but not in a river bend. So that means boats are going to follow the channel, and all of these boats had pilots, by the way. Like Mark Twain was a Mississippi River pilot, and so these are men who know the river and can read the river, and know, where what to avoid. And so Confederates studied the rivers, and they knew the areas where the channels would bring the boats closer to shore. And if you're closer to shore, then you're easier to hit.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these ambushes took place where the boats came very close to shore. And so I've got, multiple descriptions of that in the book. But then there's also a thing where, in a lot of cases, the river would do a big loop. So it's kind of like a C. Well, the Confederates, they use those places for ambushes because number one, the Union would have to come close to where the Confederates were attacking. But secondly, if you think about like the start of the sea, the Confederates could attack there. They could pack up and then they could go overland maybe a mile, while the boat has to go maybe 12 miles around the curve. And now the Confederates are set up for another ambush. So the Confederates tried to use the geography to their advantage. But then the Union sometimes turned it around on the Confederates as well. There's one case where a Union commander, his last name was Selfridge, was so tired of being ambushed in a particular spot, he drew a map of it, and it's in the OR actually. You can it's online. You can see it, and it says very bad guerrilla spot, and it was one of those loops. And so the Union, they cut a channel to make the river straight
Oh, well,
in
okay.
that area, and that led to the destruction of Napoleon, Arkansas. It no longer was a town after the change in the channel.
Oh, wow.
And there are
Geez.
other cases where the Union destroys the levee system, or actually they force enslaved people to dig a hole in the levee, and then they explode, some gunpowder in it because they want to flood out guerrillas who are behind it.
Uh,
Because the guerrillas are using the levee um, in many cases as cover.
uh. So you mentioned the role of enslaved people in some of those efforts. I want to come back to that comment you made earlier about the role of the fleet with emancipation, because
Yeah.
to me, and particularly since that was an unexpected discovery for you, so a really neat component of the book, and I think something that really adds to the overall literature of emancipation. Um, how did that process unfold, and what was the end result?
It unfolded a thousand different ways,
Uh,
across the rivers. At first, the when I say at first, so we're talking mid 1862 into the early fall of 1862. The fleet and the captains of the fleet were would rebuff enslaved people who were trying to escape, or they would not help them. We don't have the Emancipation Proclamation yet. We don't even have the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation yet. But you can tell things are moving in that direction because of what Congress is doing and the idea of contraband with Ben Butler at Fortress Monroe. But the Union sailors begin to realize that the Confederates are using enslaved people basically as a weapon in a variety of ways. Because one enslaved person ran away from, I believe it was Fort Henry, and he had been forced to dig at Fort Henry to help create the fort itself. So the Confederates are using black men as laborers, but then they're also profiting from the farm products of plantations that black men and women are producing. So, there's a book by Christopher Teeters called, I think it's Reluctant Emancipators, and it's about mainly Union officers in the Western theater and they come to the same realization. It's like, okay, we didn't enlist to become an agent of freedom, but we realize if we free enslaved people, that hurts the Confederacy. So it becomes a practical argument. And so boat captains would sometimes force enslaved men to do labor. A lot of it was shoveling coal and loading coal onto a boat. But then you had a number, even before the Emancipation Proclamation, you had officers who would essentially recruit black men for their fleet. And in the summer of 1862, when the fleet was trying to coordinate and take Vicksburg for the first time, there was a massive spread of malaria throughout the fleet. And so you have boats that are, down to 25% effective force. And this is a time when the Navy is not able to recruit very well anyway.
Right.
If men were going to join the United States military during the Civil War, they were joining the Army for the most part. The Navy is not high on most people's list, and the brown water Navy is even lower than the blue water Navy.
Right.
So they're really struggling to get sailors. So I argue that because of the necessity for manpower, even though there's rampant racism and discrimination in the fleet, they realize we need men. And so these enslaved men are sometimes even dragooned and forced to
Oh,
be
wow.
to enlist on these boats. And so I divide the war into four different phases, and they're roughly 12 months each, not exactly, but they run more or less from spring to spring. Because the war began in April of
Right.
61 and ended in April of 65. So in that first 12 months or so, 5% of the men of the Mississippi Squadron were black. And that was in accord with naval doctrine. That was policy. In the next year, it goes up to 20 something. The next year, it's just over 30%
Wow.
of all new sailors are black. And this is coming at the same time that the fleet is undergoing this massive explosion in the number of tin clads that it's putting in the water because it's got to do the guerrilla war. So the fleet cannot expand and cannot do what it needs to do without the labor of black men. And as a whole, about 25%, or excuse me, um, it was close to 30% of the fleet were black sailors. Or no, I'm sorry. It was a little over 20% were black.
Uh, wow. And I'm just kind of thinking the implications of that too. If you're putting landing parties ashore to fight some of these guerrillas, and you have a percentage of black men as part of those landing parties going
Yeah.
into this really vicious surprise fighting, that puts those guys in a special peril, because they could be recaptured, and there's, certainly some black flag
Yeah, you're
attitudes.
right, they could. And there isn't a lot of data that I could glean of like who's in these shore parties.
Hmm.
And for the most part, black men were put into the worst jobs on the boat. So coal heavers, a lot of them were servants of officers. So the classification was boy, first class boy, second class boy, third class boy. In the old Navy, a boy was literally an apprentice. He was a boy. He
Uh,
was 14 years old and he's learning how to be a sailor. In this Navy, if a black man was a boy, he could be in his 50s. And they were cooks and other things, but they were barred from uh, being on cannons
okay.
by policy. In practice, when it was necessary, They were on the cannons. And so I would expect that for the most part, if an officer was constituting a raiding party, he'd be more likely to choose white men than black men.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
there's one instance, I mentioned earlier about the captain who tried to sell his boat. Well, he put black men as part of a shore party, and they fought against guerrillas. So there's at least one incident, and I'm sure there are more. But you're right, it's sort of this double peril for them.
Yeah. You mentioned the different phases of the war that you categorize over the course of your book. Is there a period where the River Squadron comes of age? We've spent a lot of time talking about kind of its birth and all this
Yeah.
innovation, but it eventually becomes a very efficient operating force. Where's that moment?
I think it's what I call the third phase. So it'd be mid, like spring of 63 to spring of 64. And I believe that's when it's the most effective as well.
Okay.
So this is, they're under a new commander, David Dixon Porter. He is, I think, their fourth commander. They go through a number early in the war. He's by far the most aggressive commander, and he puts his stamp on the fleet. He wants to punish Southern civilians. He and William Sherman become good friends, and their letters are almost interchangeable in terms of, Sherman later writes about, I'm going to make Georgia howl, and make them feel the hard hand of war so that, they'll never return to it. Porter's writing those things in 18 at the end of 1862
Mm,
to Sherman. I'm not saying that Sherman got his ideas from Porter. I'm just saying that, they kind of fed off of one another in that way.
right. Right.
Um, now I've forgotten the question.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Just that when it
oh yeah,
comes of
yeah. So
age. Yeah.
so I think in this third phase, the fleet now it's truly a fleet. So it's got enough tin clads. It institutes a patrol system where the tin clads primarily are escorting um, uh, commercial boats from point A to point B, typically like 10 or 12 miles along, say the Mississippi River or the Tennessee River. That you have enough of the early sailors in the fleet who remain in the fleet. There is a mass exodus of men in really September and October of 1864 because their 3-year terms are up.
Okay.
And then you have a massive influx of men who don't know what they're doing, frankly. And so the fleet actually goes down in capability in those last 9 months of the war, especially.
Okay.
So it's really in that last, like that third year where the like they know what they're doing finally, and they have enough men to do it, and they have enough boats to do it, and they, I have two data sets that help underpin the ideas in the book, and one of them I went through the official records of the Navy that we talked about a little bit earlier, and recorded every time that there's information about the USS Marmora sent sailors on shore to do this, or fired its cannons at these guerrillas here. So he created a data set of all those incidents. And the fleet is most aggressive in that third phase of the war,
Okay.
both in terms of the number of incidents and the damage that they cause, and going on shore and being aggressive against the guerrillas. In the last phase of the war, they don't go on shore in nearly the same percentage as they did in the third phase.
Okay.
Because I think they're just kind of it's like being the 1-year soldier in Vietnam. Like I just want to make it to the end of my term and not put myself in harm's way.
So the book is called The Devil's Own Purgatory. Where's the title come from, by the way?
I love where the title comes from. There was a surgeon in the fleet, and he kept a diary, and he wrote letters to his wife, and he was talking about how bad life was in the fleet. We didn't even talk about really kind of the experience of the sailors, which is kind of the core of the book in some ways. Um, and in his diary, he transcribes a conversation that he had with an Irish sailor. And I can't do the Irish accent. If I could, I would, but according to this officer, the surgeon, he writes that between the mosquitoes on one side, the gorillas on another side, and the heat, it's the devil's own purgatory to be in this fleet. And so the idea is that the conditions of service in this fleet were so horrible that you're in a form of purgatory.
Wow. Well, and it rhymed as well with the
Yeah, exactly.
let's talk real briefly before we wind up because the sailor experience is the heart of the book. What were you trying to get at and explore as you delved
Yeah.
into that?
I wanted, as best I could, to tell this story from the perspective of the, if you will, ordinary sailor, not the officer, not David D. Porter, not the people in Washington. Because a lot of the other books wrote about how the fleet would attack, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and the cannons just kind of erupted from the boat itself. Now, Barbara Brooks Tomlin kind of gets into the experience of the sailors, but not as much as I would have liked. Um, she does a good job, but it's like I, had a different perspective, especially after, getting into the muster rolls. And, so one of the things I wanted to do was to kind of walk the reader through the experience of sailors in these boats. And so, coming into this project, I didn't know the ratings in the Navy or in this fleet. So I wanted, so in I think it's chapter 2 or chapter 3, it's like I kind of imagine somebody getting onto a boat and he encounters a landsman. Okay, what does a landsman do? And then he's going to encounter a seaman and he's going to encounter these other ratings. And so I wanted to be able to kind of walk the reader through the naval hierarchy, but then I also wanted to introduce them to this social world of the sailors because it's this really interesting, I think, dynamic is that these guys were hell raisers for the most part. They loved drinking alcohol for somehow they could always smuggle alcohol on board. They were disobedient to their officers. They were mouthing off all the time to their officers based on what I saw in the deck logs and the punishments. And they weren't motivated by, I'm fighting for the Union or I'm fighting to free the slaves, these very lofty motivations. A lot of them are writing about, I'm here for the prize money,
Hmm.
or I don't really know why I'm here. So they're transactional in a lot of ways, but and now I've got a cuckoo clock that's about to go off. But at the same time, they were very effective sailors. And so, one of the stories I write about in the boat is there's this sailor named Edward Galligan. He's from Iowa. And he writes in his diary about he goes to St. Louis and he gets drunk, he fights the provost guard, and he ends up in jail. And there's another time where he gets drunk and he fights with Pete the Butcher. And so he's drunk multiple times by his own words. This is in his diary. But there's another time, I mean, also he's writing about today, he's sent off to get these supplies, or they have to do all of this hard physical labor. And he doesn't write about, oh, I hate doing this labor. It's like he just seems to do it. And then he's involved in a battle and he takes a splinter. Now, we think of splinter as like a very small sliver of wood, but when a cannonball penetrated these boats, a splinter could be something the size of a loaf of bread, a very jagged piece of wood that embeds it, itself. And so they were very painful wounds. He takes a splinter to the hip.
Hmm.
He doesn't he doesn't leave his combat station. He continues fighting. And then he writes in his diary the next day, and I can't remember the name of the sailor, took my splinter out on the mess table. It's like one of his buddies operated on him when he's laying on the mess table. On the mess table is a chest where they kept their like cups and forks and that kind of stuff and plates. So how do you get to this contradiction where this guy, he's going to fight with all of his might, but at the same time, fight the enemy and not be dragged away from his gun, even though he could have easily left his gun because of a wound, but at the same time, he's mouthing off to officers and he's fighting provost guards. So I talked about the concept of masculinity
Yeah.
and how the Navy really tried to channel this masculinity in particular ways.
Did you have a particular sailor that you met along the way that you're like, geez, I'm just glad I met this guy?
There are lots of them. I mean, Galligan is really interesting. I really like John Morrison. He started in the Army, and one of the ways that the Union authorities got enough sailors for this fleet is they allowed men who had naval experience to transfer from the Army to the Navy.
Okay.
And a lot of them thought they were only going to be there, a few months, but they ended up being there, for a couple of years. Morrison was one of these guys. He was an Irish immigrant, but he had naval experience. And his diary is really interesting and it's available online. And, he's another one of these guys. Somebody else writes about, an officer writes about how Morrison punched somebody, and the quote is between the skylights. But then another time, Morrison wins the Medal of Honor, and he's on the USS Carondelet, and the it was fighting the Arkansas, and the essentially the gunners had run away from their stations. But what Morrison does is the boats were side by side, and Morrison runs along and he pulls the lanyard to fire for each of the cannons. So it goes from cannon to cannon and pulls the lanyard. So this is five different times he's doing this. And then he goes up on deck and he's with a small group of guys who's getting ready to repel Confederate boarders. And the captain is up there too, and the captain had a sword. It's kind of a funny episode to read about. But he's this really amazing contradiction. But maybe my favorite sailor was a James Dickinson. He was 13 when he tried to enlist. Tries to enlist for 13.
Wow.
He's maybe an eighth grader by our standards. He tries to enlist in the Army, but they reject him. Navy, of course, they're desperate for men. And so he lies and says he's 15, and he gets into the Navy, and he turns 14 like a few days later. So basically, he's 14 when he enlists, and he serves 1 year. And he keeps a diary during that year. And he writes about how he chews tobacco because all sailors chew tobacco. He goes to a rum den in Memphis and he gets drunk and he pukes on the deck when he comes back. He plays mean pranks on black sailors on the boat and gets punished for it. But then he also writes about how he goes on shore and he's fighting guerrillas, and how one time he was sitting on the bow of the boat and then he moved from that place and the guy who moved into his place got shot. And another time he gets shot in the knee while he's on the boat and he gets a minor wound. Talks about getting frostbite on New Year's Eve. So it's this really, really interesting
Wow.
story. It's this just, guy who's, in our world should be in middle school and he's going through these really harrowing experiences.
Wow. Wow.
And
It's
there's
a,
another
oh yeah.
for 1 minute. There's one more. So I was doing research, and there was on a website that's associated with Wilson's Creek National Battlefield, but it had some images of boats from the Western campaign, really surprisingly. But it had one sailor, and it said unidentified 11-year-old sailor on the USS Pittsburgh. And the caption below, written in ink, was "Our Bob." Well, so I go to the muster rolls and I find the name of the sailor.
Yeah.
And so I notify them. And so now they've since identified him. Robert Walker is his name, and he was a field hand in Louisiana before he enlisted on the Pittsburgh. He's the only 11-year-old black person, on the Pittsburgh
Yeah.
with the name Robert or Bob. So it's got to be him.
Yeah.
But he was likely a servant of the officers. But it's amazing that his likeness survives the war. So he's a
Wow.
really interesting guy. I would love to know what happened to him after the war.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, what fantastic detective work, and to be able to kind of reconstitute some of these men's stories based on
Yeah.
that research. Wow. So, as we get ready to wrap up, anything I haven't asked you about your book that you want folks to be sure they know?
Um, no, I mean I think it's a fun read. Obviously the folks at Emerging Civil War thought enough of it to award it a prize. So um, I think it's something that even people who are familiar with the Civil War will learn quite a bit because I think it opens a new frame of thinking about this squadron in particular and the Navy in general in the war.
The book is called The Devil's Own Purgatory. Robert, congratulations, and thanks for spending some time with us to talk about the book.
Thanks. It was my pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
Likewise. I'm Chris Mackowski for Emerging Civil War. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.